For 8 long years, every doctor told him the same thing: your son will never
Oh
hear.
my gosh, are you all
But when a
right?
maid with
Come here,
nothing but
buddy.
faith and gentle hands touched the boy's ear, she pulled out something that made even a billionaire fall to his knees. What she discovered that night didn't just restore a child's hearing, it restored a father's soul. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? For 8 long years, the Ellison mansion stood in silence, the kind that could swallow a man whole. Outside, the hills of Vermont were burning gold with early autumn light, but inside those tall stone walls, even the wind seemed afraid to move. The servants padded through the hallways like ghosts speaking in whispers, or not at all. It wasn't that anyone had told them to be quiet. It was just that Mr. Grant Ellison preferred things that way, quiet enough to hear his own regret. Every morning began the same. Grant sat at his mahogany desk in the study, a cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of medical files. He didn't read them anymore. He knew every line by heart: irreversible hearing loss, congenital condition. He'd spent millions chasing different doctors and promises across the world, and the answer was always the same. Upstairs, a boy played alone, arranging his toy cars in perfect straight lines, his small hand brushing his ear now and then with a flicker of pain. That was Noah, 8 years old. Silent since birth. Grant sometimes wondered if his son even remembered what his voice looked like when he spoke. The grandfather clock ticked too loudly in the quiet. Grant looked up at the family portrait above the fireplace, his wife Catherine, smiling back from a better life, her eyes still full of the light that left them the day she gave birth to Noah. He remembered the way her lips had moved as she tried to say something in that hospital bed. He'd never heard it. Maybe that was the cruelest irony of all. His son couldn't hear, and he couldn't forget. Maggie Sloan, the head housekeeper, entered quietly with a silver tray. "Coffee, sir." He nodded without looking up. "The town's preparing for the harvest parade," she added, trying to sound cheerful. "It might be nice to know," he said flatly. She hesitated, then placed the cup down. "It's been a long time since I don't celebrate noise, Maggie." The words landed heavy, shutting down the air between them. She left as silently as she came. Outside, children's laughter drifted faintly from the street below, the kind of sound that used to fill this house. Grant closed the folder and pressed his palms together. The smell of burnt coffee filled the room, bitter and familiar. Upstairs, Noah sat on the landing with a model airplane, his brow furrowed. He didn't look up when footsteps passed. He never did. His world was made of movement and light, not sound. He'd learned to read lips before he learned to write, but there weren't many lips here worth reading. Sometimes he'd stand by the window watching the mailman whistle his way up the road, his heart aching at the strange beauty of something he could never hear. Evening settled over the house like dust. Grant stayed in his study, staring at Catherine's face until his eyes blurred. He could almost hear her say, Grant let him be a boy, but she wasn't here and he didn't know how. All he could do was by silence, the only thing he could control. The night deepened, the fireplace crackled low. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 8. Grant raised his glass in a half-hearted toast to the portrait. "To the things money can't fix," he murmured. The house answered with nothing. Only the faint creak of the old wooden floors, the soft rustle of curtains as the wind slipped through a crack in the window. Grant stayed up late that night, long after the servants had gone to bed. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Medical charts, invoices from Switzerland, letters from specialists whose names blurred together. The fireplace had burned down to ash, but he didn't notice the cold creeping into the room. He was thinking about the first time he'd held his son, the small weight in his arms, the way Catherine's eyes had searched his for hope. She'd been gone before morning came, leaving him with a child who could not hear her name. He told himself he'd done everything a father could. He built a world of safety, comfort, and the best doctors money could buy. Yet somehow it all felt wrong, a mansion built of marble, but echoing with emptiness. Sometimes late at night he caught himself listening for the sound of Catherine humming in the kitchen, only to realize the memory was so faint it hurt to remember. In the room above, Noah couldn't sleep either. He sat on his bed, knees pulled to his chest, a small flashlight in hand. Its beam glowed across the wall, tracing the outline of the paper airplane he'd taped there months ago. The only thing he'd ever made that stayed up. He tapped his chest twice the way he always did when he wanted to tell himself he was okay. Then he touched his ear. The ache was sharper tonight, a dull pressure that made his head feel heavy. He tried to imagine what a sound might be, rain maybe, or the hush of leaves, but his imagination ran out of color before it reached his ears. Downstairs, the old grandfather clock struck midnight. Grant rubbed his temples and rose from his chair. He walked through the silent hall, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. Every corner of the house looked like a museum, polished, preserved, untouched by laughter. At the base of the staircase, he paused, glancing upward. A faint sliver of light glowed under Noah's door. He thought about knocking, then decided against it. What would he say? What comfort could he offer in a language his son couldn't hear? Instead, he turned toward the great front doors and opened one. Cold air rushed in from the Vermont night, sharp and clean, smelling of pine and faraway smoke. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing it in. Somewhere down the valley, a dog barked and headlights swept across the gravel drive, a delivery truck making its late rounds, maybe. Grant watched until the lights disappeared and the darkness closed in again. He locked the door and went upstairs, unaware that change, small, quiet, but unstoppable, was already on its way. Morning came, gray and heavy with mist. Maggie was the first to arrive in the kitchen, lighting the stove and setting out breakfast trays. The radio on the counter crackled with static before settling into a soft gospel tune. She turned it down quickly, habit, and began her rounds. The mansion was still waking when the doorbell rang. Maggie frowned. Visitors were rare, unexpected ones unheard of. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the entryway. Through the frosted glass, she saw a young woman standing on the porch holding a worn leather bag and a folded letter. Her coat was damp with morning drizzle, her shoes dusted with road salt. She looked nervous but determined, the way people look when they've run out of options. Maggie opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" "Yes, ma'am," the young woman said softly, her breath visible in the cold air. "My name's Grace Calloway. I'm here about the housekeeping position." Maggie studied her, the modest dress, the tired eyes, the polite smile. Something about her reminded Maggie of someone long ago, though she couldn't say who. After a moment, she nodded and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "It's quiet here, always is." Grace crossed the threshold, clutching her letter like a lifeline, and as the door closed behind her, a small draft followed her in a thread of warmth. The house hadn't felt in years. Down the hall, the clock ticked once, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of the Ellison mansion felt different. The door opened, and with it, the faint sound of life returning to the house. Grace Calloway stood in the grand entryway of the Ellison estate, her breath still fogging from the cold outside. The marble floor beneath her feet gleamed like ice. Chandeliers hung above her head, silent as sleeping stars. She had never seen such a house. Every surface shone, but nothing seemed alive. Maggie Sloane, stern as the brass buttons on her gray uniform, folded the letter Grace handed her. "You came from Newark." "Yes, ma'am." Maggie's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's a long way from Vermont." Grace smiled faintly. "I needed a long way, ma'am. There wasn't much more to say." Maggie motioned her forward, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. "You'll clean keep to yourself and speak only when spoken to. Mr. Ellison values quiet above everything else, especially around the boy." Grace nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" Maggie stopped in front of the wide staircase, glancing up toward the landing. The last girl thought she could help. She's gone now. Grace lowered her gaze. "I'm just here to work." Maggie studied her a beat longer, then turned briskly. "Good. Follow me." They moved through long, echoing hallways lined with portraits whose painted eyes followed her. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. Somewhere far off, a door creaked, then shut softly. Grace had worked in city hotels and brownstone apartments, but never in a place that felt so hollow. The walls seemed to listen. Every footstep sounded like a question. She was shown a small room tucked under the eaves, plain, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the sloping fields below. From here, she could see the town of Stowe in the distance, smoke curling from chimneys, a church steeple catching the weak morning sun. For a moment, she imagined herself there drinking hot cocoa at the diner, hearing laughter again. But she quickly folded the thought away, like a letter she couldn't afford to read. By late morning, Grace was in the kitchen polishing silver. Maggie's voice carried from the hallway, sharp and controlled, giving orders to the gardener. The radio sat on the shelf, volume turned to barely a whisper. A woman's voice sang about hope and mercy. Grace let it fill her quietly, her hands moving in rhythm with the soft hum. It had been months since she'd heard music this close. Her mind wandered to her grandmother in Newark, the old nursing home that smelled of lavender soap and winter air freshener. Bills stacked high on the kitchen table back home, threatening to take away the only bed her grandmother had left. This job, cold as it seemed, was her last chance. When the clock struck 11, Grace carried a folded stack of linens upstairs. The stairway curved wide and elegant, the carpet thick underfoot. She paused halfway, her eyes drawn to a small figure sitting at the top step. A boy, thin, pale, maybe 8. He sat perfectly still, toy cars lined in a neat row beside him. He didn't look up, didn't fidget, didn't hum. Only his fingers moved, brushing the same car back and forth with a rhythm that didn't make a sound. Grace stopped a few steps below him. "Hello," she said softly. He didn't react. The faint sunlight from the window outlined the shape of his head. The messy brown hair, the concentration in his small hands. Then she noticed something else, the quick unconscious gesture, a hand to the right ear, a tiny flinch, a wince that vanished as soon as it appeared. Her heart tightened. She'd seen that kind of gesture before, the silent signal of discomfort a child didn't know how to explain. She took a slow breath, then stepped aside, pretending to adjust the linens. When she looked back, the boy was watching her through the fringe of his hair, curious but cautious. Maggie's voice echoed from below, "Miss Calloway. Are you standing idle already?" Grace startled, nearly dropping the sheets. "No, ma'am." The boy turned away, his small shoulders stiffening, the cars once again lined in perfect order. Grace hurried down the hall. Pulse quickened. She didn't understand why that small face lingered in her mind, or why the faint sadness behind those gray-blue eyes felt so familiar. All she knew was that something in that house had just shifted, as if the silence itself had breathed. The rest of that day passed in careful silence. Grace learned quickly that the Ellison mansion was a world built on rules, unspoken ones mostly. Servants moved like clock hands, precise, quiet, predictable. Doors opened and closed without sound. Even the air seemed trained to behave. Maggie led her from room to room, showing her the endless things that needed polishing, dusting, arranging. "We keep the curtains drawn in Mr. Ellison's study," she instructed. "The light bothers him. The boy's toys are to be left where he places them. Never move them. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am. And don't go talking to the staff about your life. People come and go here. It's better not to get attached." Grace nodded again, but her thoughts drifted to the boy on the stairs. His stillness had spoken louder than any conversation. By late afternoon, she found herself in the long hallway that overlooked the gardens. The windows were spotless, the lawns below trimmed to perfection. It was the kind of beauty that belonged on postcards, lovely from afar, lifeless up close. Outside, autumn leaves blew across the gravel driveway like forgotten letters. Grace pressed her hand to the glass. The chill ran through her fingers. Behind her, the house creaked softly. For a moment, she thought she heard a small sound, a footstep, a breath. She turned, half expecting the boy to be there. But the hall was empty, only the distant echo of Maggie's voice reminding someone to light the evening lamps. Dinner came and went quietly. Grace ate alone in the servants' kitchen, a bowl of soup, a piece of bread and tea that had gone cold by the time she sat down. She could hear faint footsteps upstairs, the soft closing of a door. She wondered what the boy Noah Maggie had called him once did at night. Did he dream in silence? Did he ever laugh even without sound? When her chores were finished, she went to her small attic room. The window overlooked the distant lights of Stowe, where people were gathering at Rosie's diner, or maybe the church hall, sharing stories over pie and coffee. Grace missed that sound, the soft hum of people being together. She had grown up with it, the neighbor's radio, the choir on Sundays, the clatter of dishes after dinner. Here, even her heartbeat felt too loud. She unpacked her bag, 2 dresses, a photograph of her grandmother smiling from her nursing home bed, and a small Bible whose corners were worn soft from years of prayers. She set the photograph on the nightstand and opened the Bible to the page where an old bus ticket marked her last prayer from Newark. "Lord, help me find a way." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the window pane. She thought about the boy again. The tiny wince, the hand at his ear, the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow down the stairs. The memory wouldn't leave her. It clung to her heart, quiet but insistent. Lying back on the narrow bed, she stared at the wooden ceiling beams and whispered into the stillness, her voice barely more than breath. "Lord," she said, "if you brought me here, show me why." No answer came, only the soft ticking of the old clock downstairs. But somewhere in the mansion below, a small boy stirred in his sleep, turning toward the sound of a voice he couldn't hear yet. Somehow, for the first time, seemed to feel. Morning came, wrapped in fog, soft and heavy over the hills of Vermont. The Ellison mansion stood like an island in a white sea. Grace woke before dawn, as she always did, the habit of years spent working long hours in other people's homes. She dressed quietly and opened her small window. The air bit at her skin, but it carried a freshness that reminded her she was still alive. From her window, she could see the garden paths vanishing into mist. Somewhere below, a single lamp glowed from the kitchen, Maggie's doing, no doubt. Grace tied her apron, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and whispered a small prayer before stepping into the silent hall. By 7, she was dusting the study. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. She moved carefully around the massive desk, avoiding the framed photographs and the cold fireplace. On one corner of the desk, a half-finished cup of coffee had gone gray with age. She reached for it, then stopped. Something about touching what belonged to Mr. Ellison felt wrong, too personal. She set the rag down and began to hum under her breath. Instead, a melody her grandmother used to sing on quiet mornings, soft, simple, full of hope. The sound was barely more than a whisper, but in this house of silence, even the smallest hum seemed daring. Grace didn't notice that someone else was listening, not with his ears but with his eyes. At the top of the stairs, Noah stood barefoot in his pajamas, watching. He tilted his head, slightly curious. He couldn't hear the song, but he saw the rhythm in her movements, the gentle sway of her shoulders, the soft lift of her lips as she worked. Something about it made the air feel different, lighter. When she turned and saw him, Grace froze. "Oh," she said, softly smiling. "Good morning." He blinked, hesitant. She pointed to herself. "Grace." Then slowly she pointed to him. "Noah." "Right." The boy nodded. Surprised she knew his name. Grace smiled wider. "Nice to meet you, Noah." She exaggerated the word, slightly careful with her lips, remembering a trick her grandmother had used when volunteering at the local church school for children with hearing loss. Noah's eyes followed her mouth. He understood. She crouched, picking up one of the small toy cars she'd seen him with the day before. It was red, scratched on the sides, the wheels smooth from use. She held it up and pretended it zoomed across the table, making a soft vroom sound she knew he couldn't hear but could see. Then she handed it back. Noah hesitated, then took it, a tiny flicker of amusement crossing his face, the closest thing to a smile he'd had in months. Just then a sharp voice cut through the hall. "Miss Calloway." Grace turned. Maggie stood at the door, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Ellison's awake. He doesn't like noise in the mornings." Grace straightened quickly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know what you were doing." Maggie interrupted quietly. "Be careful. Around here, good intentions often turn into trouble." Grace lowered her head as Maggie walked away, her words echoing in the quiet like a warning bell. When she looked back, Noah had disappeared. Later that morning, Mr. Ellison entered the study, his usual dark suit pressed, his face unreadable behind years of restraint. Grace greeted him softly, but he barely nodded. She noticed the shadows under his eyes, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of money or medicine could erase. He sat behind his desk, opening the same folder she'd seen yesterday, pretending to read. Grace returned to her polishing, careful not to make a sound. But she couldn't forget Noah's small half-smile or the way his eyes had followed her lips. For the first time since she'd arrived, the mansion didn't feel completely dead. The afternoon light drifted through the high windows, painting thin golden lines across the study floor. Grace had just finished dusting the shelves when she heard the faintest tap behind her, the shuffle of small feet on the rug. She turned and found Noah again, standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his toy car clutched tight in one hand. She smiled gently. "Back again, huh?" He didn't answer, of course, but this time he didn't run either. He stepped closer, eyes curious. In his other hand was a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges. Grace crouched down, palms open. "For me?" Noah hesitated, then nodded and handed it to her. When she unfolded it, she caught her breath. It was a drawing, rough pencil lines, but full of care. A big house, the same one they were standing in, surrounded by trees and clouds. In the center, two figures, a tall man in a dark coat and a small boy beside him, both smiling. Grace traced the outlines with her fingers. The boy had drawn himself and his father, not as they were, but as he wished them to be. She looked up and met Noah's eyes. "It's beautiful," she said softly, exaggerating her words so he could read them. "So beautiful." He studied her lips, then pointed to the drawing again, tapping the man's face. His expression turned thoughtful, almost sad. Grace didn't need words to understand. The man in the picture smiled, but the real one never did. Carefully, she knelt beside him. She took a pencil from the desk and added something small at the edge of the paper. A third figure, a woman with long hair holding a tray of cookies. She smiled, pointing to it. "That's me. You'll need someone to keep you both fed." For the first time, Noah let out a soft puff of air, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. He touched the paper, adding a crooked little sun in the sky. Grace laughed quietly. Perfect. They stayed like that for a while, two quiet souls sharing the same fragile peace. The house, usually so still, seemed to hum with life again. Grace didn't notice that someone else was watching. From the hallway, Grant Ellison stood in the doorway, unseen. He had come down to retrieve a file and stopped short when he saw them, his son sitting cross-legged on the rug, shoulders relaxed, eyes bright, the boy actually smiling. It struck Grant like a jolt. He hadn't seen that expression since ever. And the woman, this new maid Grace, was kneeling beside him, her expression gentle, patient, entirely unafraid. She wasn't pushing, she wasn't pitying him, she was simply there. It was the kind of stillness Catherine used to bring into a room, the warmth that filled the silence without trying to fix it. Grant's hand tightened on the doorframe. He didn't understand why it unsettled him, this sudden intrusion of color into his carefully muted world. Maybe because it reminded him of everything he'd lost. Maybe because it reminded him there was still something to lose. He stepped back before they could notice him and retreated to his study, his heart oddly restless. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus on the words before him. The soundless memory of his son's almost laugh echoed inside his chest. That evening after dinner, Grace found the drawing tucked under her door. Someone, likely Maggie, must have slipped it there without a word. The paper was neatly folded, and on the back, written in careful, awkward handwriting, were two words: "Thank you." She held the note to her chest, her eyes stinging. The words might have been traced by Noah's small hand, or maybe by his father's, she couldn't tell. Either way, it meant the same thing. Grace looked out her window at the dark Vermont sky, the first snow beginning to fall in slow, silent flakes. For the first time since leaving Newark, she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Something in this quiet house was changing, and she somehow had become part of it. Winter came early to Vermont that year. The mornings turned sharp, the kind that made the windows fog from the inside. Grace learned to keep a mug of coffee close to her hands as she worked. The heat steadied her. The mansion, though, felt colder than ever. Even the fireplaces seemed reluctant to burn too bright, as if afraid to disturb the quiet that ruled the Ellison estate. By now, Grace had fallen into a rhythm. Every day began before sunrise and ended long after dark. She cleaned, folded, polished, and when she could, left small gestures of kindness along the way: a paper crane on Noah's windowsill, a folded napkin shaped like a star at Mr. Ellison's place. Little things unnoticed by most. But she noticed. And slowly the house began to feel less like a museum and more like a place where life still flickered. Noah sought her out now. He never spoke, but his silence had changed. It was no longer heavy or fearful. It was thoughtful, curious. He would appear in doorways with his sketches, show her his drawings of trees or birds, sometimes even of her. Grace would smile and trace the outlines, whispering, "Beautiful Noah, you've got an artist's heart." He'd grin, small but real, and scurry away before Maggie could catch him. The older woman had started to watch Grace with the cautious look of someone who'd seen too many kind hearts crushed by this house. One afternoon, as the snow fell outside in soft sheets, Grace heard footsteps behind her in the corridor. She turned, expecting Noah, but it was Mr. Ellison. He stood there, coat button, scarf neatly tied, holding a file in one hand. "Miss Calloway," he said, voice low. "A word, please." Grace nodded quickly, setting down the vase she'd been polishing. He gestured toward his study. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of leather and cedar. He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. "I wanted to address something." He began the words careful, as if chosen one by one. "You've been spending time with my son." "Yes, sir," Grace said softly. He's a good boy. That's not the point. His tone sharpened. My son is under medical supervision. He's not to be disturbed with sentimental distractions. The words stung. Grace folded her hands in front of her apron. With respect, Mr. Ellison, he's lonely. Children need warmth more than silence. He looked up, startled not by her words, but by the calm strength in them. For a moment, he saw something familiar in her eyes. Something that reminded him of Catherine, that same quiet courage, that same unshakable belief in kindness. It unsettled him. "This isn't your concern," he said at last, voice tight. "Please, do your work and nothing more." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Calloway," she paused in the doorway. "My son, he smiles when you're around." His tone softened barely above a whisper. "I don't know if that's good or dangerous." Grace looked back, her voice gentle. "Sometimes, Mr. Ellison, those two things are the same." For a moment neither spoke. Outside, wind brushed against the tall windows, making them shiver in their frames. Then Grace left quietly, her footsteps fading into the hall. That evening, as she prepared to turn down the sheets in Noah's room, she found him sitting cross-legged on the rug, a notebook open in his lap. He looked up at her and smiled, small, hopeful, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place downstairs. Grace knelt beside him, heart heavy with both joy and worry. The boy drew a small house, then two stick figures standing in front of it, one tall, one shorter, both smiling again. Beneath them he wrote with careful letters, "Home." Grace's eyes filled. She touched the page lightly. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." She didn't know Mr. Ellison stood in the doorway once more unseen. His heart caught between guilt and fear. That night the snow kept falling, blanketing the hills until the world disappeared under white. The mansion glowed softly against it, a single pocket of light in the dark Vermont valley. Inside, every creak of the old house sounded louder, like a reminder that silence could be alive too. Grace couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, turning Noah's drawing over in her hands. Home. The word was simple, but it carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Newark, she realized she'd stopped counting the days until payday. She was beginning to care too much, maybe. Down the hall, a muffled noise broke the stillness, a thud, then another. She hurried out, heart quickening. The noise came from the grand staircase. There, halfway down, she saw Noah sitting on the floor, his small hand clutching the banister. One of his model airplanes lay broken beside him. She ran to him, kneeling. "Noah, are you hurt?" Her voice trembled. He shook his head, but tears streaked his cheeks. He signed, clumsily fell. Then, pressing his hands to his ears, he winced again, that familiar, painful gesture. "Your ear?" she asked. He nodded, eyes wide. Without thinking, she cupped his face. "Let me see." He hesitated, then leaned forward. Under the soft glow of the hallway lamp, she caught sight of something deep inside, a shadow darker than before. Her stomach turned. "That's not right," she thought. A voice thundered from behind her. "What are you doing?" She jumped. Mr. Ellison stood at the top of the stairs, fury burning through his restraint. "Step away from him." "Sir." He fell. "I said step away." The shout echoed through the halls, sharp and cruel against the still air. Noah flinched, covering his ears, though he couldn't truly hear. The sight made Grace's heart ache. She stood slowly, trembling. "I wasn't hurting him," she said softly. "He's in pain, Mr. Ellison. Please." But the man's voice broke. "I've had enough of strangers thinking they can fix what can't be fixed. My son's condition isn't a project for you to—" He stopped, breathing hard, realizing too late that Noah was staring at him. Tears still spilling. Grace's eyes glistened. "He doesn't need fixing, sir. He just needs someone to see him." Her words landed like a whisper in a church. For a moment no one moved. Then Mr. Ellison turned away, his hand pressed against the banister as though the weight of the moment were too much. "Go to your room," he said quietly. "Both of you." Grace obeyed, but as she led Noah up the stairs, she felt the ache of defeat tightening her chest. She tucked him into bed, smoothing the blanket over his shoulders. He looked at her eyes, pleading, and signed a single word. "Sorry." She shook her head, smiling through tears. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart." She brushed his hair gently. Sometimes grown-ups get scared of what they don't understand. Noah reached for her hand and held it until sleep finally pulled him under. Outside, the storm raged harder. Grace stood at the window watching snow whip across the frozen lawn. Downstairs, through the faint glow from the study window, she saw Mr. Ellison sitting alone at his desk, his face buried in his hands. The lamplight flickered like a heartbeat, faint, uncertain, still alive. She whispered into the quiet, "Please, Lord, help him see what I see." The wind howled against the glass, but somewhere inside the great house something softer stirred, a crack in the walls of a man who had sworn never to hope again. By morning, the world had turned to glass. Ice clung to every branch, glittering like crystal in the pale light. The radio in the kitchen murmured about an incoming blizzard, the kind that closed highways and knocked out power lines across Vermont. Maggie listened, her brows knit tight. "It's going to be a bad one," she said to Grace, handing her a stack of linens. "You'd better fill the tubs with water just in case." Grace nodded. Outside, the sky had gone the color of steel. The wind came in low, restless sighs that shook the window panes. By afternoon, snow began to fall again, faster than before, swallowing the hills in white. Upstairs, Noah watched from his window, tracing little patterns in the frost with his finger. Grace checked on him between chores, always finding him in the same spot. Quiet, distant, but calmer than the night before. She left him with a thermos of cocoa and a drawing pad and whispered, "Stay warm, sweetheart." He smiled and nodded a silent promise. By evening, the storm had swallowed everything. The wind howled like a train rushing through the trees. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Darkness flooded the house. Grace froze in the hallway, her candle trembling in her hand. She could hear the storm's fury outside the windows groaning under its weight. From somewhere upstairs came the faint sound of a crash. Something falling. Without hesitation, she grabbed another candle and ran. "Noah," she called, voice breaking through the dark. She reached his room and found him standing near the desk, frightened but unharmed. The crash had been his lamp knocked over in panic. He pointed to his ears, then to the window. Thunder had rolled across the hills, deep and long. Though he couldn't hear it, he'd felt it in the floorboards, in the air itself. Grace set the candle on his nightstand and crouched beside him. "It's okay," she mouthed, touching his shoulder. "You're safe." He looked at her for a long moment, then signed something she hadn't seen before, hands pressed together, then drawn to his heart. She smiled softly. Safe. It was the same gesture he'd used weeks ago. Before she could speak again, the door opened behind them. Mr. Ellison stepped in, holding a flashlight. The beam caught them in its pale circle. Grace kneeling, Noah clutching her hand. For a moment, none of them moved. "I thought I told you to stay away from him." His voice came low, weary, more tired than angry this time. Grace stood slowly. He was scared. "The storm. I can take care of my son." "I know you can, sir," she said quietly, "but sometimes taking care means letting someone else try." The words hung between them, fragile as the flame. Noah looked between the two adults, his small face tense, reading every motion. The storm raged harder outside, shaking the shutters, forcing them all to stand closer. A sudden bang echoed through the house, a window blowing open somewhere below. The cold rushed in like a ghost. Grace flinched, clutching the candle before it went out. "I'll check it," she said, stepping toward the hall. "No," Ellison said firmly. "Stay with him. I'll go." For the first time, his tone wasn't a command. It was something else, trust tentative and unfamiliar. He turned and disappeared down the stairs, flashlight beam bobbing in the dark. Grace sat on the edge of Noah's bed, pulling the blanket around him. The boy leaned closer, eyes wide at every gust of wind that shook the windows. She hummed softly, the same melody she'd hummed that first morning in the study. He couldn't hear it, but she saw his breathing slow, his shoulders relax. Outside, thunder rolled again, louder this time, and for a moment she imagined the sound breaking through Noah's silence, the first real sound he'd ever know. Not music, not voices, but the raw voice of nature itself. Downstairs, the wind forced its way through the cracks of the old house, howling in strange notes. Grant Ellison fought with the window latch until his hands went numb, the flashlight flickering across the walls. When he finally pushed it shut, the noise dulled to a low, steady roar. He stood for a moment, breathless, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. A man with gray at his temples, eyes ringed with guilt and exhaustion. The silence afterward felt heavier than the storm itself. He turned off the flashlight and looked toward the staircase. Somewhere above, he could see the faint flicker of a candle moving Grace's light, steady and patient. For a reason he couldn't name, that small glow pulled at him. When he returned upstairs, the power still hadn't come back. Grace and Noah sat on the rug near the fireplace, a blanket wrapped around them both. She had managed to coax a fire to life its warmth, filling the room with a golden glow. Noah was drawing again, his pencil scratching faintly against the paper. Grant stopped in the doorway, watching. The sight touched something deep in him, something that hurt in a way that wasn't pain, but memory. Grace looked up and smiled. "I thought we could stay here till the heat comes back." He nodded, stepping closer. "Good idea." He hesitated before sitting down across from them. The firelight softened his face, melting the hard lines that usually kept people at a distance. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of wood and the storm pressing against the windows. Noah finished his drawing and turned it toward his father. It was the three of them this time, the tall man, the woman, and the boy sitting by a fire. The word at the bottom was clumsy but clear. Together. Grant stared at it, his throat tightening. That's us," he asked, even though he knew the answer. Noah nodded eagerly. Grace smiled. "He's telling you something, Mr. Ellison." Grant's voice dropped. "I'm not sure I deserve it." She looked at him across the flickering light. "Deserve what?" "Together," he said softly. "I haven't been that in a long time." The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks up the chimney. Grace set her cup of cocoa down and met his eyes. "Sometimes," she said, "God gives us second chances that don't look the way we expect. Sometimes they come wrapped in silence." He studied her, the glow painting warm tones across her face. "You talk like someone who's lost a lot." "I have," she admitted. "But I still believe in healing even when it doesn't come from doctors." Grant looked toward his son, who was tracing the edges of his drawing with one finger, peaceful in the firelight. He whispered almost to himself, "I spent 8 years buying silence. Maybe it's time I start listening." The house trembled with another gust of wind, but the room felt calm, anchored by the fire and the soft rhythm of their breathing. Grace rose and tucked the blanket tighter around Noah's shoulders. "He'll fall asleep soon," she said gently. Grant nodded, watching his son's eyelids flutter. "You're good with him." She smiled faintly. "He's easy to love." Grant's gaze dropped to the flames. So was his mother. His voice cracked. "I couldn't save her, and I punished the world for it, especially him." Grace knelt across from him, her tone barely above a whisper. "You can still make it right." For the first time, Grant didn't argue. He looked up, the reflection of the fire dancing in his eyes. "I want to," he said simply. Outside, the wind began to die down and the storm finally losing its strength. Inside, a different kind of quiet took its place, not the cold silence that had ruled this house for years, but something gentler, alive. As the clock ticked past midnight, Grace laid a log on the fire. The orange light washed over the three of them, flickering like hope reborn. The storm passed with dawn. Vermont woke under a sheet of clean snow, every branch sparkling as the first sunlight crept over the hills. Inside the mansion, the quiet that followed felt different, not heavy this time, but tender, like the pause between heartbeats. Grace stirred the ashes in the fireplace and smiled at the faint smell of smoke that still clung to her sweater. Noah was curled on the couch under a quilt, sleeping soundly for once. "Mr." Ellison sat nearby, coffee in hand, his face softer than she had ever seen it. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow crackle of the last ember. Then Grant broke the silence. He didn't wake up once, he said quietly. He used to cry out in his sleep. "I never knew what to do." Grace glanced at the boy. "You're doing it now," she said. "You're here." He nodded, staring into the cup between his hands. "Being here. It's harder than I thought." She smiled gently. "Most things worth doing are." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carries a little sadness in it. When Maggie appeared at the door with breakfast, she stopped short. For a moment, she simply stood there, blinking at the strange sight of warmth where there had never been any. Then she shook her head and muttered, Well, miracles come in all sizes before retreating to the kitchen. Grace followed her later to help with dishes. Maggie dried her hands on her apron. "You've done something to this house," she said without looking up. "I don't know what, but it's breathing again." Grace smiled. "I think it's the boy." "Maybe," Maggie said. "But the boy's been here 8 years. You've been here 8 weeks. The words settled deep in Grace's chest. She didn't feel like a miracle, just a woman trying to keep promises to the people she loved. Still, it warmed her to know the change was real. That afternoon, while Grant met with a visiting contractor downstairs, Grace went to tidy Noah's room. The air was filled with the soft rustle of paper sketches scattered across the floor, airplanes lined on the sill. She gathered the pages into a neat pile and smiled at the drawings, the fire from last night, the 3 of them laughing a window full of stars. Then her smile faded. Noah sat at his desk, both hands pressed against his ear, his face tight with pain. Grace's heart seized. "Noah," she said softly, rushing to him. He looked up, his eyes wet. She crouched beside him, signing slowly. "Pain," he nodded, grimacing. She touched his cheek. It was hot. "Okay," she whispered, steadying her breath. "It's all right. We'll get help." She started toward the door, then stopped. A memory flickered the first day she'd seen him touch his ear, the faint shadow she'd noticed inside. The image rose so sharply it made her dizzy. She turned back. "Can I look?" she asked, pointing to his ear. He hesitated, frightened, but then he nodded. Under the bright morning light, she tilted his head gently. What she saw made her blood run cold. Something dark lodged deep inside the canal, glistening faintly. No wonder he's in pain, she thought. How could they have missed this? For a moment she froze, caught between instinct and fear. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even supposed to be near him. But she remembered her cousin Marcus, the same pain, the same blockage, the same hopeless look doctors had given him until one nurse had dared to act. Grace straightened slowly, her pulse quickening. She had prayed for a purpose when she came here. Maybe this was it, though it terrified her. She looked at Noah, who stared back with trust shining through his tears. "Okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm going to find a way to help you. I promise." Outside, the snowlight brightened across the window pane. Somewhere deep inside the walls of the great house, a clock began to tick again, faint but steady, as if marking the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Grace couldn't think of anything else all day. Every chore blurred into another, the dishes, the laundry, the faint hum of the heater, all while Noah's pained expression haunted her. When she passed him in the hallway, he tried to smile, but his hand kept drifting to his ear. She knew what that meant. The pain wasn't stopping. By evening, the snow outside had turned to sleet. The sky hung low gray and restless. Grant was in town for a meeting. Maggie had retired early with a headache. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that felt like a test. Grace sat at the kitchen table staring at her folded hands. Her heart thudded like a drum. If I do nothing, she thought, he'll keep suffering. If I do something, I could lose everything. She whispered into the dim light, "Lord, I need you to tell me what's right." No answer came, only the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the faint wind pushing against the windows. Then she remembered her grandmother's words. "God doesn't always send help in fancy packages, baby girl. Sometimes he just sends hands that are willing." Her hands were willing, trembling but willing. She took the small first aid kit from the cabinet, the one she'd used to clean scrapes and spills. Inside was a pair of sterilized tweezers, a flashlight, and alcohol wipes. She wiped the tweezers clean again and whispered, "Guide me." Upstairs, Noah sat on his bed holding a small stuffed bear against his chest. When she entered, he looked up startled, then calmed when he saw her face. She smiled gently. "Hey, sweetheart." She knelt beside him, signing slowly, "I can help. Trust me." He hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes, then nodded. Grace tilted his head toward the lamplight, her hands shaking. Deep inside the ear canal, she saw it again, dark, dense, the same obstruction she'd seen that morning. Sweat prickled her forehead. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Please, Lord, steady me." Slowly, she guided the tweezers in. The metal brushed against something soft. Noah flinched but didn't pull away. She steadied her hand, heart hammering, and tried again, gently, carefully. The object shifted. She could feel the resistance like a thread snagged too deep. "Almost there," she murmured. Then release. Something slid free, small and wet, landing in her palm. It was dark, hardened, a plug of wax and debris that must have built up for years. Grace stared at it, disbelief and relief washing over her. And then she heard it, not a word, not even a full sound, but a gasp. Noah's eyes widened. He pressed his hands to his ears, blinking fast. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked once, twice, and he turned toward it, eyes filled with wonder. His lips parted. "Tick," he whispered. The voice was rough, broken, but real. Grace's tears came instantly. "Yes, baby," she sobbed. "That's the clock. You can hear it." Noah began to laugh, a wild, joyous sound that filled the room. He clutched his ears, spinning toward the window where the wind rattled the panes. "Sound," he whispered again, testing the word, tasting it like something new. Grace pulled him close, her tears falling into his hair. "Thank you, God," she whispered. "Thank you." Downstairs, the front door slammed open, Grant back early, shaken by the storm. He ran up the stairs, following the strange noise, laughter. He hadn't heard that sound in 8 years. He burst into Noah's room and froze. Grace knelt on the floor, trembling, tears streaking her face. Noah was laughing, clutching his ears, saying again and again, "I can hear." Grant's heart stopped. "What did you do?" he whispered. Grace turned, voice breaking. "I helped him." She showed her palm, the small dark mass still glistening under the light. This was in his ear. For a moment, Grant couldn't move. His knees gave way and he sank beside his son. Noah turned, eyes wide, and said it again, the word that shattered years of silence. "Dad." Grant's breath caught. "Say it again," he whispered. "Dad." The sound was fragile, imperfect, but it reached straight into Grant's chest. He pulled Noah into his arms, sobbing for the first time in years. "I'm here," he said through tears. "I'm right here." Grace looked away, her own hands shaking. The miracle had come, but she knew the cost might still follow. For a long time, no one moved. The house stood suspended between disbelief and wonder. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the air in Noah's room felt strangely alive, as if the silence itself had broken open to make room for sound. Grant held his son, trembling. "You can hear me," he whispered again, his voice cracking like old wood. Noah nodded through tears, his small hands exploring the air as though touching invisible music. Each sound, the crack of the fire, the creak of the floor, was a miracle, raw and overwhelming. Grace stood a few feet away, her hands still stained with traces of blood and wax. Relief flooded her, but it came tangled with dread. What she had done wasn't allowed. She knew that. She had crossed a line drawn by fear, pride, and power. When she finally found her voice, it came out barely audible. "Mr. Ellison, I only wanted to help." Grant turned to her slowly, his face unreadable. Tears streaked his cheeks, but his eyes burned with something more complicated than gratitude, shock, fear, disbelief. "You touched him." His tone was thin, shaking. Grace nodded. There was something blocking his ear. It had been there for years. "I saw it." Grant looked down at the dark lump in her palm, then back at his son, who was still whispering to himself in wonder. How could the doctors miss this?" he said, almost to himself. "All those tests, all that money." But before he could finish, Maggie appeared in the doorway, startled by the commotion. "What on earth?" she began, then froze as she heard Noah's small, broken voice say, "Maggie?" The old woman gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Dear Lord," she whispered. Grant stood, his expression torn between awe and terror. He took a step toward Grace, then another, his voice trembling. "You had no right," he said. "No training, no permission. What if you'd hurt him?" Grace's eyes filled. "But I didn't. He can hear." "That's not the point." His voice rose, echoing down the hall. "You could have killed him." Noah flinched at the sharpness of his father's tone. The boy pressed his hands over his ears, frightened, but this time the sound reached him. The world that had been silent now roared. Grace rushed to him instinctively, but Grant's voice cut through. "Don't touch him." The command froze her mid-step. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Downstairs, the security bell rang, the guards summoned by Maggie's trembling hands. Grace realized what was happening. "Mr. Ellison," she said softly, pleading, "please don't do this. You saw what happened. He's healed." Grant's voice cracked. "I saw you bleeding my son's ear with a pair of kitchen tweezers." He dragged a hand through his hair. Desperate, broken. "Do you think anyone will believe you? That I let a maid perform surgery on a child?" 2 uniformed guards appeared at the door. "Sir," one asked. Grant's eyes met Grace's. For the briefest moment, his anger faltered, replaced by something that looked like shame. Then he whispered, "Take her downstairs." The guard stepped forward. Noah screamed an unsteady, raw sound that stopped everyone cold. "No!" He cried the first word of protest he had ever spoken. Grace turned to him, tears spilling down her face. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said gently. "You're going to be fine." The guards took her by the arms. As they led her out, she looked back one last time. Grant stood frozen, his son clinging to his leg, the sound of Noah's sobs filling the hall like music that had waited 8 years to be heard. They brought Grace to the small security office on the first floor, a sterile little room with white walls, a single chair, and the hum of the old heater filling the silence. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. There was no anger in her face, only peace and exhaustion. Her palms still bore the faint marks of the tweezers. She wasn't praying for herself anymore. She was praying for Noah, that his hearing would hold, that his father would see the truth before pride buried it again. Outside the narrow window, dawn began to rise pale over the snow. It painted the world gold, fragile and forgiving. Upstairs, the mansion buzzed with chaos. The family doctor had arrived within the hour, summoned by Grant's trembling phone call. Tests were run, flashlights shone into Noah's ears, voices argued in the hall. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the tension shifting through the walls. After what felt like forever, the door opened. Grant Ellison stood there. He looked different, his expensive coat wrinkled, his eyes red. The proud precision that had once defined him was gone. He stepped inside, slowly closing the door behind him. For a long moment, he just stared at her. "They confirmed it," he said finally, voice breaking. "There was a blockage. It's gone now." Grace nodded, her tone gentle. "I know." He took a shaky breath. The doctors pulled his old files. There was a note 3 years ago. It said there was an obstruction in his ear canal. They recommended removal. His voice hardened. "No one told me." She closed her eyes. "Because they could keep charging you as long as he stayed deaf." Grant's jaw trembled. "I paid for everything, the best clinics, the best specialists, and they left him like that. My own money kept my son in silence." Grace stood slowly, her voice soft but steady. "You couldn't have known. But you see it now." He looked up, his eyes full of tears. "And you saw what they didn't. You did what I should have done years ago." She shook her head. "I just loved him, sir. That's all." Grant laughed weakly, wiping his face. "That's everything." He stepped forward, then paused, his voice heavy with regret. "I called the police before I knew. They're on their way. I'll stop them." Grace smiled faintly. "You don't need to. I'm not afraid." He swallowed hard. "Please, Grace, don't talk like that." At that moment, the door creaked open again. Noah burst in, his small feet slipping on the tile. His cheeks were red from crying, his coat half-buttoned. "Grace!" he shouted, the sound still unsteady but bright as sunrise. Grant froze. It was the first time he'd heard his son call someone's name. Grace dropped to her knees, arms wide. Noah flew into them, burying his face in her shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, holding him tight. "You can hear me now. That's all that matters." Grant stood by the door, tears streaming freely now. The guards who had escorted her looked on silently, one of them wiping his own eyes. Finally, Grant spoke. "Grace," he said softly, "you're not the one who needs forgiveness here." She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Then who does?" He stepped forward, kneeling beside them both. "I do." For a long moment, the three of them stayed like that. A billionaire, a maid, and a child who had just begun to hear the world. The heater hummed softly, and outside the window, the light kept rising. When the doctors left that morning, they carried away years of silence in a single folder. Grant didn't read it. He just stood at the gate as Grace walked out, her small suitcase in hand, the snow crunching softly beneath her shoes. She turned once before leaving, and their eyes met. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "Don't thank me. Thank the one who gave you back your son." And with that, she walked into the sunlight, her figure fading against the white Vermont morning, leaving behind a house that for the first time in 8 years could truly be called home. 2 weeks after the miracle spring began to wake Vermont. The snow-melted birds returned, and for the first time in years, the Ellison house was filled with sound, real, living sound. From his study window, Grant watched Noah running through the garden, laughing as he chased the neighbor's dog. That laughter, uneven and new, was worth more than all the money he'd ever spent. On the desk beside him sat Noah's drawing in a small frame, 3 figures by a fire, the word "Together" written in crooked letters. Grant touched it softly. The house that had once been silent was alive again. Clocks ticking, Maggie humming, even the piano, breathing under dusted keys. But Grace was gone. She had left quietly after the hospital. No anger, only peace. The letter she wrote still rested on Noah's nightstand. When you hear the birds, thank God for the sound. Don't fear silence. It taught you to listen with your heart. Love, Grace. One morning a new letter came. Mr. Ellison, my grandmother passed peacefully. I'm staying to help at the nursing home. Tell Noah I keep his drawing by my bed. God still makes miracles through willing hands. Grant folded the paper, his throat tightening. Outside, church bells rang across the hills. Noah ran toward him, shouting with joy, "Dad, I can hear them." Grant knelt, smiling through tears. They sound like home, son. That evening he lit the fireplace and played the piano for the first time in years. The notes trembled, then steadied like a man remembering how to believe. Upstairs, Noah's laughter joined in, and the house that had known only silence began to sing again. Months later, the Vermont hills turned green again. Grant and Noah drove south to Newark one quiet Sunday, the back seat filled with flowers and a framed picture that read, "Home." The Willow Grove nursing home sat beneath tall oak trees, its white walls glowing under the afternoon sun. Inside, Grace stood by the garden, her hands busy watering roses. When she turned and saw them, she froze, then smiled, eyes shining with quiet joy. Noah ran first, his laughter echoing through the courtyard. "Grace," he shouted, his voice sure now, bright and clear. She knelt, arms wide, and he crashed into her hug, nearly knocking the watering can from her hands. Grant walked closer, hat in hand. "We owed someone a visit," he said softly. Grace looked up, her eyes kind. "You didn't owe me anything, Mr. Ellison." He shook his head. "You gave us our lives back. The least I can give is thanks." They stood in the garden as the wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere inside the chapel, a small choir began to sing, low, tender, full of hope. Noah tilted his head, listening to the melody, eyes wide. Grace smiled through tears. "He hears music now." Grant nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes, and I think I finally do too." They stayed until sunset, watching the sky turn gold. When they said goodbye, Grace pressed a folded note into Grant's hand. "Some miracles are meant to be shared. Keep listening." Driving home, the boy fell asleep in the back seat, and the road hummed beneath the tires. Grant glanced in the mirror at his son, at the framed word, "Together," beside him, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for letting our house hear again." And for the first time, the silence that followed felt like peace. Maybe it's true that miracles rarely arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly in the hands of a woman who refuses to look away, in the courage of a man who learns to listen, or in the laughter of a little boy who hears his father's voice for the very first time. When the snow melted that spring, the Ellison mansion no longer echoed with loneliness. It carried the soft hum of a piano, the rhythm of footsteps, and the gentle sound of a child's joy. A house that had once been silent learned to breathe again, not through money or medicine, but through love freely given. And if you think about it, maybe that's what every home needs. Not perfection, not wealth, but people willing to show up when it's hardest. Because love doesn't demand credentials. It just asks for presence. I'm reminded of an old scene from small-town America, a grandmother setting an extra plate at Sunday dinner even when no one's expected, just in case. That simple gesture, like Grace's faith, tells us something profound. Kindness makes room before it's even asked for. It waits by the door, believing someone will need it. In a world that often measures worth by titles and bank accounts, this story whispers a softer truth, that every soul deserves a place to belong. Every mistake deserves a chance to be redeemed, and every act of compassion, no matter how small, can rewrite a life. Like a porch light left burning through the night, a single act of goodness can guide others home through storms, through silence, through all the years we thought we'd lost. So as you sit there tonight, maybe with a cup of coffee cooling beside you, maybe with the radio humming low, take a moment to listen. Perhaps you'll hear your own house breathing too full of the quiet miracles that love leaves behind. And if this story touched your heart even a little, press 1 in the comments to let me know. If you think it could shine brighter, press 0 and share your thoughts, because stories like people grow better when they're heard. Thank you for listening, my friends. May your home and your heart never fall silent again.